But Dr. Acharya, I want to roll this back to you with the first part of what Dr. Aluwale was alluding to, which is whether or not you think this is time to sort of reconsider, the FRBM itself, reconsider targets. The NK Singh panel has put out, recommendations of its own. Is it time to start considering, other alternatives, looking at debt to GDP as the primary target for fiscal policy, saying, hey, we're setting out a new glide path for us. It's a new start. Here it is. This is how bad it is, but here's how we're determined to make it better.
Mitali, my view would be rather similar to what Montek has just said, that, don't get too worried about what the existing FRBM legislation is saying. Everybody knows that those things will not be met. And don't get too hung up on how precisely you're going to formulate the glide path going out. I think the focus should be much more, you should clearly give the intention that, yes, we have a very large deficit this year for good reason, let's say. Okay, let's be clear on that. It's for good reason. Partly unavoidable. You had a collapse in revenue in the first half particularly, and partly perhaps good because that's what an automatic stabilizer does. Expenditures stay sticky just as well. And when you have revenue collapse, essentially you have a large fiscal deficit. And that's why, I've always felt throughout this year, in all the discussions, that all this wanting more fiscal stimulus was a little bit meaningless, or shall we say, overdone, if not meaningless, because you were getting a huge fiscal stimulus from rising fiscal deficits, essentially out of what's called the automatic stabilizer of the deficit rising because revenues are collapsing. So the broad pattern is very clear. You're going to have a very large deficit essentially because of a revenue collapse, not because of massive changes on the expenditure side. And next year, going forward, you're going to similarly get a huge recovery in revenues. And just to give you a little, and this sort of adds to what's been said rather than repeat what's been said, give you some sense of, I think, the order of magnitude increase you might get without discretionary tax measures or expenditure measures would be, in my view, around 15-16% very easily. And let me explain how I come to that judgment. Essentially, because you have if you accept the estimates or projections made in the first advance estimates, by the way, that's what these are, then as Monte clarified, you have a situation where in the first half of the year, GDP came down by about somewhere 15% plus. And in the second half of the year, compared to a year ago, it's going to be about the same as it was a year ago, that is 0. And for taking the year as a whole, you're getting, as a result, in these estimates, 7.7%. Now, if we don't get the kind of expenditure stimulus or various other factors that one can think of, we might have slightly larger decline in GDP, but I wouldn't worry about that. That's now all baked in the cake. It'll be what it will be. But the point here is that next year, because of your low base of GDP in the first half of the year, particularly, down 15+%, you are automatically going to get an increase, provided you come back to last year's level in the second half or near that. Then anything, as long as you stay even flat, and if that level grows of GDP, then it'll be even more cream, if you like. But if it stays flat, you still get straightaway a sort of something like an 8-9% increase in real terms in GDP next year. And possibly you'll get a little extra growth because the level will go up next year rather than stay flat at the second half of this year. So you could easily get, 10-11% even. So anywhere between the band of 8 to 11% real growth is what I would be looking for next year, without sort of doing further policy changes of any major kind. And add on the inflation. Now this is where policy does matter as to how you're going to finance deficit, et cetera, et cetera. But my thought would be that, even if you take a sort of medium projection, and which I think the RBI would go along even, something like 6% nominal increase, 6% inflation as measured by the GDP deflator, you get then something like a 15 to 16% increase in nominal GDP straight away. Now that gives you, with sort of what a usual assumption is, that revenues should grow at least at that unit elasticity of revenue to GDP. So you get a 15, 16% increase next year. And my own view would be that the effort should be to use quite a lot of that increase to bring down the centre's fiscal deficit from somewhere, as Montek and Sajid seem to say, the clean deficit, the cleaned up deficit with off budget and all tucked in, from somewhere between 7 to 8% of GDP is what I would be looking for if the cleanup has been done, and perhaps 6 to 7% of GDP if the cleanup hasn't been done. Let's assume the cleanup is done, because, as Montek said, it's a great opportunity for transparency. So from 7 to 8%, I think we should be thinking of a target of about 5% cleaned up deficit next year, which, by the way, is roughly what it has been last year and the 2 years before that, if you take into account the CAG comments and all those things, and think of it as a clean deficit and not the so-called shown deficit of 3.5, and all that. So that's what I'm saying one should do, and leave further consolidation for later. And maybe you give a glide path and maybe you don't. I don't think that's going to be policy-wise in the short run that important. I think the direction should be clear. That's important for credibility. But I think getting to 5% will be A, feasible, not difficult, and B, desirable. Because if you don't do that, you leave this large debt growing sharply in the succeeding year as well. And that will strain the credibility, not just of our creditors, but it will bring into question all sorts of other things, including the ability to manage inflation credibly without doing effectively much more RBI financing of the deficit indirectly. And that's the real danger. So I think our worry should be that our concern should be to bring down the fiscal deficit to something like 5% of GDP on a clean basis. It'll still require a fair amount of financing, but that should not be a problem. It should keep the government debt to GDP ratio in the 85% to 90% range, which will probably end up this year anyway. But importantly, it won't lead to a massive increase in that. And I think that is important. And the degree of financing that's required will basically allow your borrowing program to be in much more reasonable territory in the next year, and will not create this sort of massive liquidity expansion that we have seen. This year, that's been fine because your output levels have been so low. But next year, I think you'll see much more spillover into inflation if you manage to only reduce to 6.5% of GDP from something like 8% at the central level.